Thank you so much. Let's just have another round of applause for all of you who are here. You made it, you stuck around, you came inside. Feel free to take your clothes off. I know it's a little hot in here. I'm going to take off my jacket. And I'm so excited to welcome our panel. Again, my name is Sean Schaffner. I'm the founder of the Poop Project. You saw me in the film. I'm the constipated one who sings about it. And getting a little reverb on this mic. Yeah. Oh yeah. And let's give a hand for Josh, our producer. And thanks to Josh, this panel. So one of the things, just before we introduce our panelists, a little context. Flush was filmed beginning in 2010, and the film went into the editing room in about 2015 and was finally released the first time in 2017. So it's already a little aged, you know. And I think it has a particular perspective that is super valid. And also, one of the reasons we love to do these panels is because there's a lot more perspective. And even though the system that we live with is problematic, as you saw in the film, it also is a miracle of modern science. And because of that system, none of us are getting sick on the regular from bacterial illnesses caused from poop being in our water, in other places. None of us, I'm assuming, have piles of shit in our backyards. You know, so there's really an enormous scientific miracle that is the current engineering system we live with. And just for that, and for these representatives of our water and wastewater systems, let's give them a round of applause. They don't get to come into the light very often. It's true. It's true. Which allows them to grow their hair long, but nonetheless. So, and this panel, just to say, is also being recorded for posterity because it's a very exciting time to have these experts of both a local and national front. So, with that said, I would love to introduce them, and in fact, I'll have them introduce themselves because no one wants to hear me read a bio. First, we'll have Brian Mosby from the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission in Maryland. Yay! So Brian, you want to share your, I just said your name, but you can say it again, your pronouns if you like, and what you do and where.
Sure, thank you. I'm Brian Mosby, I'm he, him. I have been working at the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission for about 27 years. I graduated here in DC from Howard University, and I graduated in May of '94 and started working at WSSC in June of '94. And I was just talking to James, and we were talking about our careers. And we at WSSC has three, we call them water resource recovery facilities now. They used to be sewage plants, and then they turned into wastewater plants. So now they're water resource recovery facilities. But at any rate, WSSC has three water resource recovery facilities in Montgomery County, and they have three in Prince George's County. And I've worked at all of them over the years in different capacities. So today, what I'm here for doing now is what we call bioenergy. And it speaks directly to what we've been watching today. And be happy to talk about that more with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's just keep going down the panel. You don't need me to say your names for you. Go ahead and introduce them.
Hi, my name is James Satui. I work at DC Water. I'm currently the program manager for biosolids. Currently, DC Water produces what's called a Class A biosolid, which means we can use it safe for any application. We call it Bloom. We sell it all over the city, Maryland, Virginia. Yeah, and I was just commenting to some folks. It's unfortunate you couldn't, in the film, get into the wastewater plant because we take sort of the opposite point of view, which is like, we want to be honest about what we're doing. It's like, fundamentally, I'm an environmentalist. I care about reusing these resources. There's a lot of benefit that you can find in recovering the organic nitrogen and replacing synthetic fertilizers if you do it correctly. And before I worked at DC Water, I used to work at a company called Blue Tech Research, which looks at water treatment innovation, which in our industry is very slow. Utility is very kind of conservative in their decision making, which can be a little frustrating, but you know, the reality is there's a lot of interesting technologies that are coming out, albeit being slowly.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. And let's keep going. And oh, I just wanted to say too, you can buy Bloom at Ace Hardware just up the street. So if you want, you've all contributed to it, most likely if you live here in DC, so you can spread it on your gardens. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bree Nakamura. I am a Practitioner of Innovation at the Water Environment Federation. We are a national nonprofit that represents people who work in the water industry. So we have over 30,000 members throughout the US and also globally that work anywhere from, at a water resource recovery facility, all the way to, you know, engineers and consultants and government officials who all work in the water space. So we're really excited to, you know, see more people talking about water and poop, obviously. We do everything, we cover everything besides municipal drinking water, basically. So stormwater, wastewater, industrial water usage. So a lot of the different usages that you would see on the film as well.
Thank you, Bree.
And I'm Christina Surface. I'm with the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, or NACWA. So we are a trade association based in DC, which represents municipal wastewater and stormwater treatment agencies around the country. So collectively, we've got about 350 public clean water members, and they provide sewage services to the majority of the sewer population around the US. And so we do advocacy in Congress with EPA on behalf of our members, and then work closely with some of the other nonprofits like WEF in the water space. My background from Milwaukee, which has a growing sort of culture and awareness around water and like the water-rich assets that they have there. One of the first, their municipal treatment plant was one of the first to produce milorganite, or they produced a product called milorganite reusing biosolids. I think the first in the country to have done that. So there's just a lot of interesting history there around water, and I was excited that more people, it was just more growing awareness around water and wastes and what happened to it in our country.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge too that there's a lot of experts here, because all of you poop every day if you're lucky, and use your toilet system. And we also have some people who I know are even a little higher grade experts than that. Kim Nace, who is in the film from the Rich Earth Institute, is here in our audience. She's waving. That's the organization in Brattleboro that recycles the urine. So, and I think there may be others who are in the water professional industry. That was not a phrase. Who are water professionals. I believe we have some others. Barry Liners here from WEF, and Christina brought a Bree brought a colleague. The WEF people have really turned it out today. I mean, what can you say? So that's also an opportunity to just say, like, I don't want to be the only one asking questions. If you've got some ideas, some input, some things we really want to know about, please raise your hand. Let's get this in here and have a conversation, because we're basically around the dining room table. So I think, James, you kind of started us off a little bit to reflect on the film itself. And so maybe a good place to start is really asking, how did what we saw in Flush reflect the reality on the ground as you know it, both locally, and of course we've got our local representatives here, and also nationally. I think some of what we saw is replicated around the country, and there's other things that are completely different. So can you just help to lay the field work based on what looked like right from the film, what you think it might be missing that people want to know about, or even what you think might have been misrepresented in the film that you want to put a different face on? James, you want to start?
Yeah. I mean, I particularly liked how the film really approached the idea of like our aversion to waste, because that is certainly very accurate. And as someone who tries to sell this as a product, like that is something we confront on a daily basis, trying to get people comfortable with the idea that you know, if this is done correctly, like you can reuse this material and make it safe. I think, you know, it's unfortunate they weren't able to get into the wastewater plant and get a tour. One of my favorite parts of my job is giving tours, because it's like, this is something that a lot of people don't know about, and it's such a critical piece of infrastructure, which is critical to the level of sanitation that we enjoy in our world presently. I would say in terms of, you know, like, you didn't get a chance to really see what biosolids application could look like. And New York in particular has a varied system, a lot of different wastewater plants and a lot of different places that the biosolids go. So there's landfilling, there's incineration, which is unfortunate because that means you're not reusing that material. In our region, a lot of our biosolids is reused either as a Class B or a Class A material. Class B meaning it's not used for human consumption, so that's used pasture lands mainly. Class A can be used anywhere. It can be used on farm fields like corn, soybeans, wheat, grains is really common what we use right now, especially this time of year and with the fertilizer prices right now. We're totally sold out through the entire spring, which is great. But it's also used on fields. We've been used on the National Mall, we've been used on a lot of different school lawns and that kind of thing. So the applications are basically wherever you need organic matter, wherever you need nutrients. So there's a lot of different places that the biosolids can be used. The other thing which Bree brought up, which is you can dry it out, you can bag it, and you can sell it in stores. You mentioned that with our product. We don't have really that much of a bag presence, but organized and leading that for 90 years. So you can see these pelletized fertilizers in stores. So yeah, there's a lot of different places for this kind of nutrient. And I think the only thing I would say is there's a perception because everything goes into the toilet that fundamentally what's there is going to be toxic. And that just isn't accurate. You really have to look at each situation in particular. If you're getting a lot of industrial flows into your waste system, then that is going to end up in your biosolid. Probably you're going to have a lot of concentrations of volatile organic compounds, benzenes, the kind of thing that you don't want to reuse. But if it's like DC, where we don't have many industrial flows, the primary flows are municipal, residential. You do have cleaners and things like that, but their relative concentration in the solids isn't going to be significant to be of impact. It'll be in parts per billion. So the relative risk is insignificant relative to the loss of what you would do if you had to landfill all this. I keep track of our carbon footprint model, and in the unfortunate event where we have an issue at the plant, we have to landfill material which hasn't happened in years. You're having to take that carbon, put it in a landfill, and then it's going to be turned into methane. And if our focus is holistic, you want to avoid that as much as possible because the global warming potential of methane is so much more powerful. And so again, it's like you want to look at what is the actual risk of this. The EPA has something called the RSL, regional screening levels, for a lot of these chemicals that aren't specifically regulated, where they look at what's the concentration that's going to have an impact on causing cancer at 1 in a million. And a lot of wastes are going to have levels well below that for most of those chemicals, in which case that relative risk is fairly minimal compared to the risk that we put ourselves in every day. Like in a car, your risk of death is 1 in 10,000, and we could do that every day. And so when you're talking about what do we do with the system that we have, you want to try and make a decision that's holistically as optimal as possible. We have these large systems because we have concentrated populations in cities. It would be lovely to have these low-scale diversion systems, which are starting to kill about. I mean, that's much more efficient. Decentralized wastewater treatment is much more efficient. Unfortunately, this is the system that we have. So how do we make it as sustainable as we can? So that's where you want to make sure you're not looking at in black and white with these things and trying to understand the balance of opportunities and risks and costs.
Yeah, thank you so much. Brian, you want to take it to keep us local for a minute?
Yeah, keeping it local, WSSC Water, we're really following behind the footsteps of DC Water. Currently, our plants, we do produce a Class B product. So we do beneficially reuse our biosolids. Right now, what we're doing is we're actually building a facility that's going to be producing the Class A, and hopefully we'll get into some of the markets and the things like DC Water is doing. Currently, all 6 of our plants, they have a different process to reach Class B, but that's ultimately what we do. We do have one plant that landfills the product, but that's going to be changing real soon. But I did want to echo on something that was said earlier here is we need to stop looking at what goes down the toilet as a waste product and more as a resource. And I mentioned before that we had different names for the plants. Before it was a waste water treatment plant because we thought of it as waste. But now what goes down the toilet is something that we can kind of bring back and beneficially reuse, and that becomes a resource for us to have that gas that we're going to be recovering and then ultimately reducing our carbon footprint.
Right, I mean, I think the opportunities are really massive when we talk about this rebranding to resource recovery is not just a communications issue. It is actually a change of the paradigm, I think, as well, to a landfill into what else can we do with this? How can we create more circular economies? I'll have to pass it down the line. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, the documentary was really interesting, and for us, I mean, the biggest thing that we appreciate is that people are starting the conversation and talking about it, right? A lot of times, and the documentary pointed out really well that what people use in the bathroom is pretty taboo and people don't want to talk about it. So for us, as an organization that represents all these people who are, treating it daily or working on it daily, we want people to really understand what it means when you flush something down the toilet, or understand what it means that, your water is going to be treated. And my favorite images, especially for DC Water, is when there is a big storm event and, there's a lot of runoff, you see the outlet right by DC Water's Blue Plains plant, and the water is always so clean compared to the rest of the outfall that's coming down the river. And just knowing that, the technologies that we have now are really pushing forward for making it as clean as possible when something does go down the toilet and comes out at your local river. I'm a second generation water engineer, so for me, I've always kind of been surrounded by water and poop, and I remember like my mom taking me to my first wastewater treatment plant when I was a kid, and her being like, or water resource recovery facility, sorry, now, for her being like, oh, it smells like money, because this is what pays the bills, so no, you have to appreciate it. But I know I am lucky in that retrospect that I've always kind of been comfortable in that environment and knowing how important water is as a resource. And it's not something that, we're really trying to instill through WEF and other avenues in kids at a young age. We do a lot of different programming like what to flush. So that's basically trying to teach kids, hey, what's safe to flush down the toilet? Maybe don't put your goldfish down there. Definitely don't put your pills down there. Wipes, obviously a big issue, especially in cities like DC. So those are just kind of making it more of a conversation so that people look at water professionals as a resource and not necessarily somebody who you only see when, there's backups in your basement or when it's an emergency. Kind of just to build on it, starting around the conversation, WEF a couple years ago worked on a film, a documentary as well with Blue Tech Research. And it also featured Matt Damon. I know Matt Damon made a cameo in this film, and we have Matt Damon in ours as well. It's called Brave Blue World, and you can actually find it on Netflix. And it really kind of opens the idea of, how we can be using water as a resource and the big perspectives of the different types of innovations that are happening and going into, people making biosolids or using biogas in that, or even just how you're getting water, and maybe it's from the atmosphere, maybe it's how you recycle it in your home. So it's just, for us, it's exciting to see the conversation just continuing and getting bigger.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think something that really struck me with the film was the real, people have a lot of curiosity around what is happening with their waste, but there's a real disconnect with it, and you flush it and it goes away, and that's what everybody wants, right? That's a successful sewage system. You don't have to worry about managing your own waste, but then you're disconnected from what's happening and ways in which you can, improve how it's managed and improve how, water resources are protected in the area. And there are things that even as an individual, that we can do around, I think the film mentioned things like, not doing your laundry, reducing your water flow use when there's storm events to help prevent combined sewer overflows. Things like downspout disconnects or rain gardens in your yard, again, to control water where it lands and help it stay out of the sewage system. There are things, and obviously with not using wipes, not flushing pills into the system, things like that, that individuals, have a meaningful impact on their system. And so, just better education, better awareness around this is so important. And then the other thing that really struck me with the film, I spend a lot of time in my work around water infrastructure funding and financing and trying to help local communities and investing in their systems. And there's and water rate affordability, water and wastewater bills have been growing for years and years. They're projected to continue to grow over time, continually well above the rate of inflation. And for so many households, it's becoming increasingly unaffordable, and it's a huge challenge to pay your water bills. And that has a direct impact, obviously, on what utilities can do. And in a lot of communities, there's a lot of sense of kind of between a rock and a hard place. If you want to do more, but you can't do more, and raise rates. Historically in the U.S., when wastewater treatment plants were initially being built and upgraded in the 1970s, and we had the Clean Water Act in 1972, and it was calling for major investments in utilities nationwide, there was significant federal construction grant funding to help utilities upgrade their systems. And that lasted for a decade or so, and then it was ultimately shifted in the Reagan era into more loan financing to kind of help communities invest, but all funds that needed to be repaid, which is all to say that the majority of the costs are borne by local ratepayers for water and wastewater systems. And there's it sort of flies under the radar, especially among renter communities where you're not getting a direct bill in most cases, and it's different for energy bills or gas bills. Renter households or multifamily households, you typically still get a direct bill that you have to pay, but for water, it's typically just for the building itself, and so your water sewer costs are baked into your rent. And so there's just another level of separation into what you're paying, what it costs to provide the water and sewer services. But that's just a huge area of challenge for communities and for households.
Yeah, I think the separation issue overall is a really tricky one, and even as we talk about like water professionals, right? Or we look at the names of these organizations: the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, DC Water, Water Environment Federation. The only organization represented here that mentions toilets sort of indirectly is the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission. And I don't know about you, as a New Yorker, the Department of Sanitation primarily, to me, were the people who picked up my trash. So when we talk about how are we talking about these issues, I think we're already a little bit challenged, right? That it's like we have these taboos, we're coming in with them, and I guess this feels kind of Marxist, right? But it's like that separation exists in all these places. It's really easy not to think about what happens after you flush because you don't see it after it flush. It's easy to not think about where the water really comes from because as long as it comes out of the tap, like your point of engagement is kind of the end of what we have to do with it. And so I think it's an interesting challenge of how do we both navigate these taboos in ways that invite the conversation while also not sometimes push against them in ways that actually flare them up so that people don't want to engage. I would love to think that maybe at the end of this, James, we could take a field trip with you to get a tour of Blue Plains. Is that?
Oh yeah, we had to start it
it?
because of the pandemic, but
Oh,
yeah. Hopefully we're giving tours again, but absolutely.
That'd be great.
No, they're super fun.
So
because it's like if you've ever been to the southwest of DC, I'm sure you've smelled it. It's a very large facility, it's like 200 acres, and there's so many unit operations. And it's always good. I always like showing people where it starts because it's so awful and smelly. You start with the grid and just the gross trash, and then at the end of it, you get to a really nice, clean effluent that you're putting back into the river. Because ultimately, the goal is to put water back in and not impact the river system. And it's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah, so one issue that we heard a lot about in the film that I know I wasn't familiar with before the film came to be are combined sewer overflows. And I think it's a more talked about issue in DC. I'm seeing a lot of people nodding, so I feel like, but maybe we could get a sense, what is the state of things in this area and what's the state of things nationally? Because I think one of the things about this issue that also, it's such an ire for environmentalists, it deals with the river quality, but in some ways it's like, it's such a small portion of the amount of water and poop and everything that gets flushed down our toilet. So I almost wonder if it's received outsized attention based on how big of a problem you think it is. What if we start in the opposite direction, just so we can get things going in a different flow?
Sure. So the question is kind of what's the state of?
Yeah, like is combined sewer overflows, is that a problem nationally? What are the things that are being done about it? How much attention does it deserve?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it deserves a lot of attention, and it definitely has received a lot of federal attention since I would say like the late 80s. In 1994, EPA adopted a combined sewer overflow policy, which set limits for the number of sewer overflows and the volume of sewer overflows that needs to be treated every year. And since then, over the past kind of 25 years, communities have been working on long-term control plans, entering into federal consent decrees to get to achievement with that framework. I looked up New York City DEPs a little bit. They have a total of, given the scale and diversity of the system, looks like they technically have like 11 different long-term control plans, all working with construction goals and timelines to get into compliance with that. Combined sewer systems are pretty concentrated in the U.S. in older areas in the Northeast and in the Midwest. Today, or more modern systems, they do separate systems, so you don't have what's coming out of homes and what's collected in the stormwater systems coming together. There's, in my opinion, pros and cons to that. The good is that you don't have the big impacts of rain events where then you have sewage overflows. The downside is then you have less treatment of the stormwater on a routine basis. But that's sort of the more modern way of doing it is to not have all of that inflow. You guys can give a great example of what's going on with combined systems in DC.
So DC Water was affected by a consent decree in, I believe, 2009, and we had to create the Clean Rivers department. So basically, as part of that consent decree, we built I believe there's going to be 3 large combined overflow tunnels, one in the Anacostia, which was completed in 2018, another one in the northeast boundary tunnel, which goes, I think, from northern part of Anacostia through Rhode Island, terminates around the Shaw area. And then there's going to eventually be one up in the up through the Potomac, up to Georgetown. So these tunnels can, I believe, house about a few hundred million gallons in a rain event. That all gets sent, instead of going to the river, gets sent to Blue Plains. And as a result, since it's been on, like, we've seen a marked increase in the water quality in the Anacostia. There's the Anacostia Watershed Society, which tracks like the biodiversity, the amount of visible trash, and they've noted like a marked increase in like, the ecosystem in the past several years. But ultimately, the challenge is all of these things have cost. These projects cost about $2 billion to build a pretty large tunnel, and the reality is, while we're building these things, the weather system is changing. So the once in 100-year storm is now the once in 25-year storm. And 2018 is a great example. We had a few days in August where you had 10, 12 inches of rain fall in a very short amount of time. And even the new system that we built, you're still going to get CSO overflows. And so you kind of have this balancing act of like, how much can you build versus how much money do you have, and how much can you mitigate this issue. And some of the negative parts of that are, as a result of building these tunnels, we had to raise rates, but that created a lot of issues. We created the impervious area charge, and so for certain ratepayers, that was a significant cost increase, and there was a lot of politics around that, and ultimately we freeze those rates in 2017, which is when I started. And that has had a direct impact on the overall quality of what we can do with the authority, because suddenly we have this piece of infrastructure, we have to build it, we have to follow the consent decree, but now we have to just do it with our existing budget, which means cuts in other directions, cuts in the wastewater department, cuts in the water treatment department, and a decline in the delivery of service. So it's constant balancing act of like, what can you do with the EPA consent decrees and the environmental goals that you have, and then what's the resources that you have to achieve that. So definitely a lot of improvements, but it really is compounded, like I mentioned, with climate change, because you have a system that is now unpredictable. Like for engineers, we're taught to design buildings, to design water systems with these safety factors based on historic data. That historic data is now somewhat irrelevant and changing, and so ultimately our infrastructure has to adapt with that, but that's like it's a moving target, and is a challenging thing to do when you're trying to do big infrastructure funding and say, we're gonna build this thing for 50 years and it's gonna work like this, and then 10 years down the road it's somewhat insufficient. So there's definitely been some really positive things with Clean Rivers, but of course there's just the ongoing challenges of anything related to infrastructure.
Thanks, James. Bree?
So it's interesting, so James mentioned the tunnels, the deep tunnel systems that we have here in DC, and one of the biggest impacts was that they saw a huge reduction in flooding, especially in low-lying neighborhoods like in Bloomingdale in downtown DC, and one of the big things is for homeowners themselves, they're seeing less basement backups, especially when renters or people are renting basements. But DC did a really great job of getting the public engaged as they were building these tunnels. They actually had a Twitter stream for the very, very giant pieces of construction. It was like this really big drill, basically. So they had like a whole Twitter of like this drill being like, hey, I'm drilling here now, like just to get people excited about it, and the fact that like when there is a big storm event, they know where exactly their water is going, and the fact that it's being stored here until it can be treated rather than getting released. In my past life, before I joined WEF, I was a consulting engineer here in the DC metro area, and would basically watch hours and hours and hours of sewage videos, which doesn't sound super exciting, but it's a necessary thing. I came out of school during the recession, and one of the nice things about being in the water industry is that people are always going to need water. So even during the recession, I was able to find a job in the water space because it's not something that's going to go away. But one of the big things, and I think about CSOs in particular, is that it's not always just from the rain events. A lot of times CSOs are caused because there is a lot of additional inflow and infiltration into our systems that's not just coming from your toilets, and it's not just coming from the stormwater systems, it's coming because the pipes in our infrastructure are cracked, and maybe there's rain leaking into the pipes that way, or the water table is rising, so there's water coming into our flows that way. So a lot of it has to also do with how our systems are being maintained, and the fact that they were built with 50 years in mind, and maybe they haven't been replaced or lined or checked on in 70 years, 75 years. So doing consulting here in DC, we look at some of the tapes, and we sometimes might even run into like a wood pipe, which was installed in God knows how early. but it's different situations because of lack of funding, and because of lack of awareness. It wasn't something that people really thought about until it was too late, and maybe their utility was under a consent decree at that point. In addition to tunnels, we're seeing a lot of cities build these kind of big storage areas where they can store their water for these large rain events, because people are realizing that green spaces in cities are important, and it's something that we want to be able to use constantly. And I think the Potomac and what River Keepers and the Anacostia river groups have done has just been phenomenal to getting people to appreciate what they have more, and also being more aware of the situations when it does rain.
Yeah, and pointing out, as I think you mentioned, that these giant tunnels are one way to soak up that water so that we can hold it before it gets to a treatment plant. But another thing is green spaces and the more impermeable surfaces that we have. One of the things that happened in New York is they were looking at, in terms of water rates, actually charging giant buildings differently than they would charge residences, because a giant building has a huge roof, and that roof is impervious, impermeable, all of those things at once. So I think when we look to what can we all do, just planting our green spaces, keeping them rich. Brian, how about you? I know you also worked on Alexandria River News.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you want to talk about that or add something else into this?
No, just to provide a different perspective. WSSC Water has a separate sanitary sewer system. So WSSC Water has about 5,000 miles of pipe in the ground to collect the water that we use. So it's interesting that we note that those pipes are old. WSSC Water started back in the 1900s, I think it was 1918. And we do have an aggressive pipe replacement program, and part of it is as a result of a consent decree that we had. We did have a lot of overflows despite not having a combined sewer system. And a lot of it is because of inflow and infiltration. So even though you don't have a CSO, you can still have problems with overflows. As far as Alex Renew is concerned, they do have a program in place now where they are developing pipe tunnels. That project is probably in the middle of its phase. It should be complete, I guess, in about 2 years. It's called River Renew. And they're following the same philosophy as when you do have those storm events, instead of having that water just rush into the Potomac River, it would actually be held in the tunnels and then slowly released back into Alex Renew water resource recovery facility.
And they've also done a lot of marketing. They're really proud of that. They want people to know where their money's going. If you go online, there's an animated character. She's like, I'm a drill, and there's a coloring book you can download. They really want people to know and be excited about what's going on, which makes sense. I feel there are so many questions that I want to ask. One is that you started to bring up climate change a little bit, or that's been coming up, and it's a huge challenge for a lot of these resource recovery systems, particularly because if they're taking water in, they need to put water out, and a lot of times that they're built on the seaside, on the ocean side, because that's the place to dump the water. So as sea levels rise, this becomes more and more of a challenge for these giant $30 million plants that, unlike Rhizome, which is in a few months going to be literally picked up and brought forward so a giant development can be built exactly where we are by these lovely people out here who are walking around surveying the space. Right, you can't just do that with a wastewater treatment plant. So maybe that's an invitation to say, what is going on in the world in order to respond to some of these challenges, and what is the future of this system? And I guess maybe something else I would just say is, I think as we hear about some of these regulations, and the whole history of our wastewater system, I said this to James yesterday, we're built with our eyes and our mouths and our hands, and they're all facing forward. and our butts are behind us. And so there's this habit as people to just be like moving forward of like, gimme, 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 and whatever came back out is like, I don't even know. You know, when we talk about some of these waterways, I remember, I think when New York first got piped water in, the amount of water people used on average a day rose basically overnight from like 1 gallon to 30 gallons. Right, so it's like as soon as you have a tap that it flows, we just use it. But you can see by this patchwork of like, well, now you have to be taking responsibility for these chemicals. Now you need to be watching these nitrogen loads. That the way that we're keeping track of what we've left behind is so much more like, you know, trying to catch things as they fall, as opposed to really making conscious decisions beforehand. But now we know so much more. So what do you think is going to be happening in the next, I don't know, 10, 50, 100 years? Where's the sector headed? Who wants to take? Brian, you got it, or Bree?
Okay, where are we headed? That's a loaded question. I think in terms of climate change, you know, we're constantly looking at how our water resource recovery facilities can be more resilient, but also the way that we talk about water. I love that Brian keeps pointing out that it is a water resource recovery facility because water is a resource and we need people to think about it in that way. For, you know, where we discharge water, how we use it, there are a lot of advancements that people are using in terms of like how we put it back into the community or how we put it back into maybe even the water table. Hampton Roads Sanitation District, which is down in kind of the Virginia Beach-ish area, actually has a program where they're doing direct recharge into their water table there from their water resource recovery facility. Water reuse is also another big topic. It's the idea that, you know, sometimes the water coming out of our water resource recovery facilities is actually cleaner than the water that we're getting in our rivers. And our drinking water facilities are actually taking water from, you know, these water area bodies, either a river, a lagoon, or down our groundwater table, and then are treating it so that it can go to your pipes. But what if we could go directly from the water resource recovery facility that's already been treated and then source it out that way? Unfortunately, you know, there's lots of regulations about that. Also, it's kind of similar to the film. People are kind of like, well, I don't want to drink shit water. That sounds terrible. Why would I want to do that? But, you know, the idea is that it's about education. It's about letting people get more comfortable with the idea that the water coming out is clean and it's safe. And we actually started a program, it's probably been maybe almost 5-6 years ago now, called the Pure Water Brewing Alliance, because for us, we were like, well, who uses water on the daily? And it's brewers. And what do people love? They love beer. And so maybe they don't want to talk about poop, but they like to drink beer. And we found that, you know, brewers are actually like little savants of water. You might just think of them as like stonery, like maybe just like local guys kind of thing that like to make beer, but at the same time, they really appreciate water. I almost think of them as like how people have that conversation about where the best bagel is, and they're always like, it's New Jersey because our water's so hard, or whatever the conversation is, but they have to have a certain type of water to brew a certain type of beer. And so for us to say, hey, we have this water, it's coming straight out of a water resource recovery facility, but we can tweak it so that it's exactly the type of water that you want to use when you make your beer. And then to have people, you know, drink the beer and then not even know that, you know, this was made out of recycled water. It's kind of a fun conversation to start, but also it's the idea that, you know, it is a resource. Technology has gotten so good that we can treat it to these levels that it's safe to drink. And it's just getting people comfortable with that conversation.
Yeah, and after a couple of beers, they're not really going to be as concerned.
Also that.
No, I got no drink this. Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah, it's funny. And we come up with really fun names for the beers. Like there's like activated sludge, like cider or beers, and like I mean we actually have a home brewer on staff that gets water. I'm not quite sure where they get their water from, so I don't want to say which plant it is. Alex Ferneau, thank you. And we do home brews and things like that. But right now it's fun due to regulations. We can make this beer and we can give it away for free, but we can't sell it. So.
Wait, so where do we go to get it? Where do we get the free beer?
Unfortunately, we haven't had some in a while. So WEF puts on a really large conference every year. It's called WEF Tech. It's the largest annual water conference in the world. We get about 20,000 water nerds there every year to come and learn about what's new in the industry, and we usually give it away there. But we've also partnered with some really big breweries to kind of promote this. We've partnered with, oh my gosh, I'm blanking. What's the one? Thank you, Stone Brewing, out in San Diego. They also have a facility down in Richmond. It's in the Milwaukee area. They have a huge pure water brew kind of program, and they actually have a big home brewing competition. And similarly in Oregon, I know there was talk about Portland, Oregon in the film. Oregon also does a really, really big home brewer competition where they give this treated water out to home brewers to do it. So it's getting national, but it's a great way to start the conversation and to get people to realize how much technology has advanced as well.
Right, so just going back to the question, and one of these possibilities is to really get us comfortable with water recycling, and that if we want to continue to have water running through our taps and we want to have the populations we have, then we need to begin accepting these technologies, because the technologies are there. It's really a lot of the public perception that keeps them from being implemented. Brian, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to just briefly go over the history, very briefly. Back in the day, the philosophy was the solution to pollution is dilution. You know, so basically you put it in the river, it gets diluted, everything's fine. I think in general, the more we know, the more we learn, the more we expect. So there are pollutants that we didn't even know about 10, 20 years ago, that now that we know about them, we expect things to be done about them. And unfortunately, the ways that the current wastewater treatment plants or water resource recovery facilities, but you know, at the time they were considered wastewater treatment plants, they weren't designed to remove every possible constituent that you could find in the water. We have advances in medicine. We have advances in technology and things that we use, and there are pollutants that we haven't even discovered yet. So I just think, in general, the more we learn, the more we expect. I don't think that that's gonna stop.
Yeah. So where else are we headed? What else is in the future of flushing or not flushing? Chelsea Wald, in her recent book, Pipe Dreams, she calls this Lutopia. So maybe from those we haven't heard from, what else do you think is in the future of Lutopia?
Well, I think, you know, the reality is a lot of our systems are dependent on a lot of investment in infrastructure that came out of the federal government that doesn't exist anymore. That's true with roads, and it's just as true with wastewater. So you're going to have to get a little bit more innovative, regardless from your finances, on recovering these resources, to look more innovatively at, like, well, if I'm not able to raise my rates, I'm not able to get federal grants, what am I going to do about generating revenue? And that's where you can seize on these opportunities of, like, what are the resources inherent into the wastewater? Like, there's nutrients, there's interesting things you can do with carbon, there's interesting things you can do with bioplastic production. So there's a lot of unique technologies that you can do to produce resources from these materials. The other side of it is, you know, we found, like, the way we think about the water system is it's a patchwork over a century of different things. You know, like if you think about like a car, you know, you've got the body of, you know, a Chevy Impala, but you've got the engine of, you know, a 90s Mustang, and it's this patchwork of different technologies that's slowly been added, and somehow you're expecting this thing to work, which with any other technology you'd be like, well, that would just explode. That's a terrible way to build something. But the reality is these things are built, they're hard to move, and you have to sort of build around them. And one of the things that's very challenging is pipes. Pipes are just so expensive. And a lot of technologies are focused on decentralization. So in cities where you have small footprints, building smaller wastewater plants. Building wastewater plants in a building, I was talking to Kim about this, about how that allows you to do a lot of more interesting things, because if you're at a building scale, you can more easily divert different waste streams, and you're not worried about like large capturing systems for the stormwater. And so there's a lot of work on that as well. And again, the benefit to decentralized systems is they're a lot more adaptable, because the reality is like the big systems we built aren't going to change quickly, and they're not going to adapt very quickly to a changing world. You know, like we have this big plant at Blue Plains, and you know, we're slowly increasing the size of the seawall as the estuary gets higher and higher every year. But like the reality is, you know, over the past 50 years, the amount of flood events in DC has gone from like a couple of days a year in the 1960s to now like 30 or 40, and then in the next 30 or 40 years, that's going to be up to the hundreds. And conversely, places like California, we're going to deal with a lot more water scarcity. So you're going to have to think about more creatively how do you adapt to these types of very quickly changing situations? So again, smaller systems potentially that are more adaptable and more replaceable. I don't know if that's what would happen. Probably, hopefully, some things.
Yeah, Christine.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think for large, municipalities, large cities, the systems that we have today are going to be in place yet in 50 or 100 years. What we're going to see is greater innovation, better approaches at resource recovery. So recovering the water, recovering the gas and the energy from the systems, recovering the solid wastes for reuse. That, we're good at that. We're getting better at that, right? But there's other, the film even talked about the gold content that's coming out of the sewage system. There's other opportunities for greater recovery of valuable nutrients, removal of other pollutants that we're finding. So more adaptation on those systems. And I think outside though of large urban areas where municipal sewage system makes sense, we're going to see more differentiation in sort of the solutions, right? More small scale community harvesting, recycling, reuse of their waste streams. For areas there's still areas of the US that have never had adequate wastewater treatments in their homes, and I think where is a sense that for a lot of areas geographically, given the local environmental conditions, the types of soils, conventional decentralized systems like septics aren't a solution, and they're too costly, and you have areas where there's been reliance on septic systems for decades, and those are failing, and that's creating a lot of nutrient pollution and other issues. And so I think we're hopefully at a turning point of just a lot more innovation in what makes sense for smaller scale systems, what makes sense maybe for individual households where they're not going to be connected. That I think will be a lot of change from sort of the one size fits all that we've had in the past.
Thank you. I love this because I think it speaks to something we are understanding in other areas of our lives, that diversity is what makes us stronger, right? And that's true in our microbiomes, as we saw in the film with fecal transplants, folks suffering from C. diff and other illnesses. It's true in our communities, and it's true in terms of our infrastructure as well. Also just want to call out the work of Catherine Coleman Flowers and her book, Wasted, I believe it is, which is specifically about Alabama, Lowndes County, which is an area of rural Black folk who have never had adequate septic or sewage, and there are about 2 million people in this country who don't have adequate sanitation, and that includes folks like Catherine Coleman Flowers has worked on with her communities, and also our houseless communities, which again we'll be talking more about on the April 9th event back here at Rhizome. And the work of the book, The Other Dark Matter by Lena Zeldovich, which came out recently, that also goes into a lot of more information. There's a great chapter on DC water and talks about methane production, other possibilities. Two other things I want to note, and then I think we're going to begin to wrap. One is that in terms of that decentralization, the system you saw in Portland in the film has now been licensed by the city of Portland to be an official model for something that is legal and able to be implemented. So we're also seeing the codes shifting to what people can actually do. And I know that the Rich Earth Institute is still doing their work, and Kim, if you want, I'd love to give it to you for a second, just to say what's happening at Rich Earth and what's some of the progress that's going on there.
Thank you, Sean. I'm really excited about it.
Actually, do you want to come up and take the mic just so we can catch you for the audio recording too? I know, I'm sorry, I should have warned you to do that.
That's okay. That's okay. I always love to talk about what we do. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hi, my good friend Sean. We met at the United Nations.
In 2013.
2013
Yeah.
for the first World Toilet Day. We've been fast friends ever since. But just real briefly with Rich Earth, just like in Oregon where they've broken down that regulatory barrier with the community there, we're also very proud that we have created a regulatory pathway in our state for collection, transport, treatment, and application of urine as fertilizer. That's taken a lot of time, a lot of energy, but people are able to use our permitting process, to work in their own states to work on different ways to make it possible to reuse your bodily waste as a resource in a more simple and closed loop situation. I'm really happy. Last week we got the good news from the National Science Foundation that we're going to have $1 million grant to work for the next 2 years on a high-strength wastewater treatment concentration and sanitizing system. So we were talking about the distributed building scale systems. That's what we are really working on. After a bunch of years of working with urine in our community, we knew that if it was ever going to make it into a peri-urban or urban setting, that the transportation of a final product, a fertilizer product, had to become concentrated because it would never work. That's a big expense. So we're very proud. We're hoping to have our pilot, our equipment, our new product out for beta testing in 2023, and hopefully there'll be some pilots in buildings at about 30 occupancy and above. So we'll take a high-strength wastewater, like it could be source-separated urine or source-separated black water with dual piping in the building for the gray water and the black water. And so it's exciting. We started, it's a very small grassroots organization. The other thing that we do that you might be interested in, if you're interested in our work, we have a good website that explains a lot of what we do, but we also have an annual conference that started in 2015 with 15 people, and during the pandemic we had over 200 people from 6 continents represented who are all working on different various technologies and approaches to urine diversion. So we're in that innovation sector, and we're hoping to provide some of those new ideas for the next 100 years.
Thanks, Kim. I like to think about it as like I can take that from you, like a PSA, or a CSA, right? Like your farmer brings you a box of vegetables, and maybe in the future you'll bring them your freeze concentrate urine as a thank you, and they'll grow back your crops. So I wanna wrap us up, but I'd love to just offer one more thing. Like we've got all these people who have stuck around and are interested. So what is something that each of us can do to be a part of the system, to help get us to Utopia, whatever that vision might be? And maybe we could just go down the line and offer some suggestions of, either how we can be involved in the system that currently exists in a way that's wholesome and beneficial, how we can help to promote the systems that are to come, or anything that we haven't thought of yet that you really want to get out there into the world.
There's a couple of public service announcements that WSSC Water has. The first one is can the grease. We try to make our collection system more sustainable by not doing things that purposely make it go bad. So grease, of course, hardens and it can create leaks. The second thing is pee, poop, and paper. Those are the things that we primarily should flush down our toilets. And the last thing I would say is that we just need to be more aware, because there are things that we can do in terms of contributing or volunteering to make things better. Like, there are a lot of areas that if we were just to clean those areas up, it would help, because there are, especially in a combined sewer system, runoff. And the more trash and the more chemicals, people change their oil and they pour the oil down the drain, and that kind of stuff. Just being more aware, being more conscious of our own actions.
I want to follow up some of that. And whenever I do tours, I always like to talk about everything you put down in the toilet ultimately comes here. And a lot of the first part of a wastewater plant is these big screens that capture trash. So what I always tell people is, you can put trash down your drain. It ultimately is just going to go to the same place. You just spend more money to get it there. And the big one with that is flushable wipes. They're just terrible for pumps and pipes. So you can put them down the toilet if you just like your system to be less affected. Be more conscious of those systems and what they're doing. And also, I think all of us here, the utilities are mostly public. They're there to serve the public interest, and there's a level of accountability there that doesn't necessarily exist with other organizations. So I would encourage people to be aware that a lot of people that work for these places, are trying to do good, and are more and can be open to feedback, and ultimately we have to respond to that. And so instead of looking at us as these big monolithic organizations, there's a lot of good work that's being done at a utility scale to try and meet these challenges that we face both environmentally and energy.
We at WEF also love the 3 Ps, so only flushing, pee, poo, and toilet paper down the drain. But I also have actually heard the 4 Ps lately, so it's pee, poo, toilet paper, and puke.
Does menstrual blood start with a P?
Period. That starts with a P. It could be the 5 Ps. big thing is people, flush and forget, and I think that was echoed a gazillion times in the film as well. So just having people talk about it is what we encourage. We work with a lot of the utilities and a lot of our members, promote the 3 Ps throughout, because there are, so part of my job at WEF is to also work with both manufacturing corporations, but also the municipalities with legislation around flushable wipes. DC had a very interesting case around flushable wipes a couple of years ago that actually ended up in a lawsuit, so maybe not so successful. But for us, it's just getting people more aware, knowing that, water professionals are not the people that you call in an emergency. Hopefully it's somebody that you're integrating into your community and you're thinking about in that way. It also reminded me when you all talked about the UN, that water is a global problem. It's not just a US problem, it's not just a localized problem for us. And at WEF, we are a UN water partner, and we support the Sustainable Development Goals, which are goals that are set to help improve the world by 2030, with SDG 6 being around water conservation and scarcity, and the fact that there are billions of people in the world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation. So it's the idea that, making sure water is part of the conversation when we're talking about conserving or climate change, or the fact that it is a resource, it's not going to go, or it's a necessity of life, and it's also something that people tend to take for granted. So that's a big one for us. On a separate note, since I do have people that seem to be interested in water in the room, WEF is actually working with the UN. We work with an organization called Unleash, which helps promote the Sustainable Development Goals and actually puts on these hacks virtually. We did one last year actually around the Alabama Black Belt sanitation situation. And it's bringing young professionals or seasoned professionals, or people just interested, to these weekend events to talk about how they can improve a certain problem. And we actually have one coming up in April around conversations of how we talk about water resource recovery facilities and the resources that are water. So if you are interested in that, I can definitely share more information too. But it's just, the idea of continuing the conversation, and that's kind of what we hope to do.
Thanks, Brayden. I'll be one of the experts helping with the education at the first April 2nd of that Unleash Hack. Yeah.
Well, I'm last on the line for this one. Everybody has said so many great things already. I'll just leave it at that. Being water aware, seeing the challenges, seeing the opportunities everywhere you look. Education outreach is so important. So thanks for all this today.
Oh my gosh, thank you all so much. I will add also, just for my own practices, is we don't flush in our household when we pee. We save those flushes. So there's water. There's like 5, potentially, depending on how large your toilet is, water you could save. Installing those toilet tank banks that we got from Montgomery County DEP. We're so grateful that they were able to join us today to give those out. And also, sometimes I pee in jars and then I pour it out on street trees. So there's a way to use that pee. I'm not flushing it. I'm fertilizing. I really want to have a pee-in one day where we all pee and then dump it. I don't think it'd be illegal, because if we're not peeing outside, then there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, so thank you so much. Let's give our panel a round. We'll be around. I see Brian has a big stack of cards. I'm sure everybody's really happy to talk to you. We'd love to see you again April 9th back here for Assume the Throne. May 7th at Lost City Books for How the Potty Trained Us. Let's give a round of applause to Josh, our producer. And if you'd like some elephant dung stationery from Mr. Elipu, I'll be over there with those, and also able to sign and sell books. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.